Questions on a statement on Myanmar made in the House of Commons on Tuesday the 2nd of February. Front bench speakers. Lord Collins of Highbury.
My Lords, this appalling action by the Myanmar's military leaders represents a flagrant breach of the country's constitution and fundamentally undermines the democratic right of its people to determine their own future. My Lords, in the week since this statement was first made, we have seen the people of Myanmar take to the streets to demand democracy. The police are now using rubber bullets, tear gas and water cannons against these peaceful protesters. Many of those brave people have tweeted their own experiences, which I have seen. On the subject of social media, I hope the government will look again at how the UK's CDC has been investing in Myanmar telecoms companies that have been complying with the country's government-ordered repression and blockages of internet sites. And they, of course, are now being used in the military coup. My Lords, as the military act on their warning of a violent response, the UK, as the penholder of Myanmar at the Security Council, has a responsibility to stand up for the democracy and against the coup. And I welcome the speedy action in convening the UK UN Security Council and the consensus in calling for democracy, freedom and human rights. My Lords, however, these words must now be built upon. Can the Noble Lord the Minister confirm whether the UK intends to bring forward further resolutions to the Council? And of course, yesterday, President Biden issued an executive order enabling his administration to immediately sanction the military leaders who directed the coup, their business interests, as well as close family members. The first round of targets would be identified this week, and steps were being taken to prevent the generals having access to $1 billion worth of Myanmar government funds held in the US. They will also impose strong export controls, freeze US assets that benefit the Burmese government, whilst at the same time maintaining support for healthcare, civil society groups and other areas that benefit the people of Burma directly. And of course, about an hour ago, I saw Dominic Raab's tweet welcoming the actions of President Biden, but was not committing to follow them. So what practical steps are the government taking to mirror and support our US ally in doing this? And what are we doing to ensure, as President Biden asked, for other allies to back those sorts of actions? Across the UN system, there is much more that the UK can do to hold the Myanmar military to account. At the ICJ, the UK government, unlike Canada and the Netherlands, has refused to join the genocide case brought by the government of Gambia against Myanmar, which would have raised international awareness of this crucial issue. And of course, in recent days, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar has called for a special session of the Human Rights Council. Does the UK intend to pursue such a session, utilising our seat on the Council? And given concerns that the military are following through, as I said, with their threats of a violent response to those peaceful demonstrations, can the Noble Lord the Minister tell us how we will be working with allies to analyse the reports from these protests to ensure that the international community can most effectively respond to any such repression and hold those people responsible to account? My Lords, this House will be aware that this week there was a leaked FCDO assessment that shows that the government are concerned by the prospect of violence in Myanmar. My Lords, as the UN penholder and President of the Security Council, it falls to the UK to lead. And I hope the Noble Lord the Minister will outline a comprehensive strategy today for confronting the intolerable actions of the Burmese military.
Baroness Northover.
My Lords, I would like to thank the Noble Lord the Minister for bringing this statement to the House. and it is indeed extremely concerning that once again the military has taken over in Myanmar. The military say that this is because of irregularities in the elections, even though, as the government and others have said, there's no evidence of significant problems in an election which delivered an overwhelming majority to the civilian government. Once again, we see the damage done when, in liberal democracies, leaders say that elections in their own territories are fraudulent, when there is no evidence of that, or they seek to break international law, even in a limited way. We need to rebuild respect for the rule of law globally. The government is right that this coup threatens Myanmar's recent progress. There have been widespread demonstrations, and we're beginning to see the army take more aggressive action, for example with the use of rubber bullets and, it seems, live rounds. A couple of days ago, a woman was shot in the head and critically injured. Could the Noble Lord update us on how they see the perceived risk of army brutality being unleashed on the protesters? And does the government think that the military leaders in Myanmar are confident that their army will fully support them, given such widespread opposition, especially amongst young people? And we do hear that some police have crossed over to join the protesters. And now we hear of a draconian new cyber-security law being fast-tracked, which would force internet and mobile phone providers to share their user data, which is extremely worrying. Can the Noble Lord comment? And could he comment further on what role that China is playing in Myanmar, following on from what Lord Collins has just asked? It's perhaps not surprising that they blocked action in the UN Security Council, but I am glad, as is the Noble Lord Collins, that the UK took that. Popular protest is not something that the Chinese government could easily condone, but we gather that they are playing a more significant role in Myanmar, and this is what they jealously guard as their neighbourhood. And what is happening on the Thai border, and what is the attitude of the Thai government, itself under great pressure, with protests again against authoritarianism there? We will indeed need to work very proactively with others if we are to help protect the many demonstrators from a brutal crackdown. One key recommendation is that we should work with others to sanction military companies. The military earns a great deal from their businesses, and this has funded their attacks, including, of course, this coup. The UN fact-finding mission had already recommended that sanctions be put on military companies even before this coup. I'm aware that the UK put Magnitsky sanctions on 16 individuals in the Myanmar security forces. However, these freeze assets in the UK, which they do not have. I realise that these sanctions may be sending a warning to others in the region, and important in that regard. But in this case, they're not very effective in the case of Myanmar. The government, as President of the UN Security Council and the G7, surely should lead the way in terms of a widespread arms embargo on Myanmar. So what are we doing, for example, with our EU allies and others on this, or on other strategies? The US has indeed just placed sanctions on those who led the coup. Is the UK engaging with the US on how to make such sanctions as effective as possible? Do the US plans include military companies? The asset freeze announced by the US on Myanmar government assets in the US certainly sends a strong signal that this regime is illegitimate. In addition, the UK should formally join the ICJ genocide case, and I agree here with the Noble Lord Collins. Could the Noble Lord update us on that? The government has said that they're considering this. Now is surely the time to do so. And could the Noble Lord comment on the very vulnerable Rohingya and other minorities in this situation? What emerged from his discussions of last week with the Bangladeshi government? And what preparations are being made if there's an increased outflow of refugees? We don't want borders closed, as we saw before, but we recognise Bangladesh's need and that the refugees need to be properly supported. As the Noble Lord knows, over 1 million Rohingya refugees have fled Myanmar over the last few years. The military leaders in Myanmar's brutal assault against the Rohingya was described by the UN as, and I quote, a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. We cannot stand by and allow further such crimes to follow this coup. So could the Noble Lord tell us what effect will the government's decision to cut the aid budget have on their ability to sustain the level of humanitarian and development funding that has gone to Myanmar and for the Rohingya refugees? In this very worrying situation, I look forward to the Noble Lord the Minister's response.
Minister, Lord Hammond.
My Lords, may I firstly thank both the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover for their contributions, and rightly they've raised a series of issues which I will seek to address. The Noble Lady, in her remarks, asked about an assessment of the current situation. As the Noble Lord Collins noted as well, it's a week since we last discussed this, and let me assure both and the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord, indeed your Lordships, that we have been not just monitoring but also acting. Clearly the situation over the weekend of the 6th and 7th February saw large-scale protests. The Noble Lady rightly pointed out about the scale of protests, both in Naypyidaw but also in Yangon. But what we have seen noticeably is largely, and I use that word very deliberately but carefully, peaceful protests. And the Noble Lady is quite right to note that in many instances the police themselves have been restrained in certain protests than maybe many people were expecting otherwise. We are, though, as the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord both raised, concerned at further reports of crackdowns on protesters in Naypyidaw on the 9th of February, including, as the Noble Lord Collins noted, the firing of rubber bullets and the use of water cannon. It remains unclear whether security forces have discharged live rounds, although that was being reported. And one particularly shocking case, as I was looking into this, was of a lady being shot in the head, which has been widely reported. In terms of the Noble Lady's point on the cybersecurity law, I too have heard about actions that are being proposed in that respect. The Noble Lady would have noted the internet blackouts which have taken place, and we are concerned about these, which have made information flow in and out of the country that much more challenging. We are clear that the internet services must be maintained and freedom of expression protected. And at that point, may I just pick up the point that the Noble Lord Collins rightly raised about the CDC. The CDC itself, on every investment, of course, carries out due diligence it makes, including in its contract with Frontier. The investment was made to ensure low-cost internet availability and focused primarily on key areas, including Yangon. There was a Myanmar government directive to all ISP providers in March to block websites, which Frontier and others have followed. Of course, the UK has taken a number of steps about the issue of censorship of websites, but I note very carefully what the Noble Lord has said in this respect, and it is part of our strategy on ensuring that the internet is restored at the earliest possible sense. And I would add that the investment was made with the good intent of providing those most vulnerable access to the internet. The Noble Lady and the Noble Lord rightly raised the recent announcement which was made by President Biden and his administration, and indeed my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, this morning tweeted about our support for the actions taken. And whilst I cannot, and I know at times if I was sitting on the other side of the dispatch box it is frustrating, we are looking actively at all tools at our disposal. As the Noble Lady Baroness Northover rightly noted, of the 16 sanctions, just to put that into context, 14 have been directly rolled over and have become applicable in UK law, which were part of what we led on the EU. There were another 2, most notably the current Commander-in-Chief of the Army and his deputy, that were part of the first tranche of global human rights sanctions that we reduced, and they also stay in place. The Noble Lady raised the issue of the UN fact-finding mission, and there were specific individuals named on that. I can reassure her all 6 that were named within that report are part of the sanctions regime that the UK currently applies. I note the point that was made in the context of both individuals and other organisations and firms, and all I can say at this juncture, of course, is that we are, of course, looking at the actions. I come back of the United States, but I come back to the point as well, it does require also coordination, whilst there may be signals sent. As I've said repeatedly, I know the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord share my views on this. It's when we act in conjunction that we see the best benefits on those that we are seeking to target. The Noble Lord Collins asked for what actions the UK has taken. He's rightly again pointed out that we are penholders on the issue, particularly of the Rohingya, but we are also currently presidents of the Security Council. In this regard, we did convene a specific meeting on the 4th of February, and notwithstanding the point that the Noble Lady raised about the role of China, and I totally concur with the Noble Lady's assessment about the importance of China's role, not just in the current crisis, but the continuing challenge around and the situation and suffering of the Rohingya community, that China has an important role to play, and both through our bilateral engagement and that at the UN Security Council, we of course continually remind China of its important role in this respect. And it was noticeable that whilst there was no resolution, there was a statement issued by the UN Security Council about the worrying nature of the events and the military coup in Myanmar. And we will continue to look at the situation during our presidency for the remainder of the month. The Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady also asked about actions that we've taken, including at the UN Human Rights Council. Again, this is something that I myself, as Human Rights Minister, have prioritised, and we called together with our EU colleagues. I was somewhat expecting the Noble Lady to ask me about the EU, but I'm proactively providing the situation, the information to the Noble Lady, that we work together with the European Union colleagues at the Human Rights Council on Monday, and we are convening a meeting tomorrow on the particular situation at the HRC. We are, of course, formally members of the Human Rights Council as well. In terms of the ICJ action, which again Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover referred to, we are very supportive of Gambia's action. They talked, and just to put it into context, about the UK's formal intervention. We are looking at that. A number of countries have stated their intent to, but are yet to intervene. There is a structured process at the ICJ. Part of that process was that for Myanmar to come back on what was levied against them by Gambia and others. They, I believe, have responded. I think the other countries who have said that they will intervene formally are now considering their position, and as will we, to see when a formal intervention in support of the action, which we do support, but in terms of formal intervention, when that will be best suited to give greater credence to the role of the ICJ in this respect. So I do hope in the responses that I've given on some of the specifics, both the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord Collins will appreciate that we are taking a very proactive engagement on this across the roles we have, including in the G7, where we both Noble Lord and the Noble Lady would have noticed we issued a statement as G7 presidents on the 3rd of February. We're using our role at the UN Security Council and at the Human Rights Council. One added information, we have, through our ambassador, also attended a briefing with the military-appointed foreign minister, but we use that occasion through the ambassador to once again communicate our unequivocal condemnation of the coup directly to the representative of the current military leaders who are in charge in Myanmar. We join all countries in calling for the release of those arbitrarily detained, not least Aung San Suu Kyi. And just picking up on the point of elections, which the Noble Lady raised, yes, as we all know, some of these elections are not the most perfect elections one can imagine, but nevertheless there were external observers, and it's not for the Myanmar military to call upon it when generally the reports were that this was notwithstanding the disenfranchisement of the Rohingya, but putting that issue to one side, other people within Myanmar participated fully, and the result was very conclusive. So I will continue, and I assure the Noble Lady and the Noble Lord through engagements beyond the chamber, I will continue to update both the Noble Lord and the Noble Lady on the ongoing situation, and will seek to provide briefings in a timely manner.
We now come to the 20 minutes allocated for backbench questions. I ask that questions and answers be brief so that I can call the maximum number of questioners. I call Baroness Hellich.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend for his statement and the update that he has offered. There are immediate actions that must be taken, and I would like to draw his attention to New Zealand actions that were taken, suspending all military and high-level political contact with the country, including travel ban on its military and leaders. But at the same time, we must also look at this moment of crisis and recognize the depth of Myanmar's challenges and its fragile democracy. Progress is impossible without progress on a range of fronts, like racial discrimination and violent conflict, to inequality and underdevelopment. And I hope that our engagement with Myanmar will go beyond this immediate crisis to look at these endemic problems that the country has been suffering from.
My Lords, I take on board what my noble friend has said about the military and looking at the situation of the arms embargo. As my noble friend will be aware, the UK is a long-standing supporter of an arms embargo on Myanmar, and we played a key role together with our EU colleagues on the arms embargo on Myanmar following the 2017 Rohingya crisis. Since we left the EU, we have transitioned these into domestic law. She makes a broader point about the importance of stability within Myanmar, and we are working in the region, particularly with ASEAN, who have an important role to play in this respect.
Baroness Faulkner of Margravine.
My Lords, I notice the Minister's warm words about cooperating with China and drawing the importance of this matter to China's attention, but will he accept that the military coup would have been impossible had the military, given their very strong relations with China, not had the nod from the Chinese government? So this is another win geostrategically for China while the West stands helpless. Can he tell us what long-term plans the United Kingdom has to reform the United Nations Human Rights Council so countries like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia are prevented from making a mockery of global human rights?
My Lords, and the Noble Lady said I had warm words for China. I was merely reiterating our practical engagement with China. We should not forget that China is a P5 member of the UN Security Council. And as I've said a number of times on various issues, where we have even challenges directly with countries who are P5 members, and I strongly believe on this, I've seen the benefits myself, we must continue to engage, albeit in very candid terms, with them through these international fora, of which the UN Security Council is important part. The Noble Lady raises the important point about the Human Rights Council, and I agree with the Noble Lady. There are members of the Human Rights Council who do in any way reflect the value system that we subscribe to, and I can assure the Noble Lady that through our engagement at the Human Rights Council and those who put themselves forward for election to the 47 membership of the Human Rights Council, we look very carefully at the human rights records of those countries. But it does still, not without its challenges, provide a very useful forum to bring these issues to the front and to bear at the top level of international diplomacy.
The Lord Bishop of Coventry.
My Lords, would the Minister join me in paying tribute to the civic and religious leaders in Myanmar, including the respected Buddhist monk Mayawada Sayadaw, now imprisoned, and Cardinal Charles Bow, Archbishop of Yangon, whose published message last week spoke out strongly against the coup, called for the release of everyone detained, and implored demonstrators to remain non-violent. My Lords, given the Cardinal's words to the international community that engaging the actors in reconciliation is the only path, in what way is the government, in the channels of communication to which the Minister referred, pressing the military to engage in a meaningful process of dialogue with the democracy movement, and at the same time, picking up Baroness Hellich's point, pursue a new peace process with the country's ethnic minorities that could prevent an escalation in armed hostilities and lead to a genuine, inclusive political settlement for all stakeholders.
My Lords, may I firstly join the Right Reverend President in paying tribute to the courage of many voices within civilian society, including those of religious leaders who call for peace. The situation with the Rohingya underlies the importance where religion is sometimes used as a very divisive tool to particularly target particular communities because of their faith or ethnicity. On the issue that the Right Reverend raises about engagement with the military, our own assessment is there's a real fear that even under civilian administration we saw the challenges that were present. The situation is playing out, but I don't feel at the moment it's on the cusp of any real hope to seeing the resolution of the internal civil issues which confront Myanmar. However, we will continue to work through all channels in pursuit of that common objective.
Baroness Gowdy.
My Lords, the Noble Minister has talked about the United Kingdom having sanctions, but whilst welcome, they're directed at individual members of the TAP model. Will he not agree that brave activists in Burma need to see tangible action by the international community against the institution of the TAP model? And won't the best way to achieve this is not by withdrawing of trade privileges or preferences, which may and would impact on ordinary Burmese people, my Lords, but by a robust and targeted sanctions on military-owned and controlled companies and their substantial business associates, including around the world.
My Lords, I can reassure the Noble Lady that our targeting in terms of our sanctions, as and when we impose them, is intended to identify both individuals and indeed organisations who are responsible for the most egregious abuse of human rights. And as I said earlier in response to a question from the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lady Baroness Northover, we are keeping the situation very much under review, and we've noted the action others have taken, most notably the United States.
Lord Campbell of Pittenweem.
My Lords, yesterday I sought to encourage the Minister to support President Biden on the issue of arms exports. It will come as no surprise to him, therefore, that I equally seek his support for President Biden's initiative in relation to sanctions. But may I raise with him the question of live ammunition? In their discussions with the ambassador from Myanmar, has the British government impressed upon him that the mere presence of live ammunition carries the dangerous risk of misjudgment and potentially resulting in fatalities, and that live ammunition should neither be on display nor indeed should there be any question of it being used?
My Lords, I totally concur with the Noble Lord, and let me assure the Noble Lord we have called in the ambassador of Myanmar and conveyed to the ambassador the people's right in Myanmar to peacefully protest should be respected. We've also urged all forces, the police and the military in particular, to exercise utmost restraint and respect human rights and international law. As I said earlier, there have been reports of live ammunition being used, and of course that is appalling, but I totally concur with the Noble Lord's views.
Lord Howell of Guildford.
My Lords, both the government statement made here and the measures announced by President Biden are encouragingly robust. But would my noble friend agree that sanctions which isolate Myanmar as a whole will merely drive it further into the arms of China, and that they should therefore rightly be targeted on military leaders, Magnitsky style, and on the business that they control, as others have rightly argued? And would my noble friend further agree that this is a time for a really strong Asian coalition, and that these steps must have the full support of Myanmar's main Asian investors, such as Japan, and that if China wants to regain any respect at all on the international stage, it should support or at least not counter these moves?
Again, I can assure the noble friend I agree with him. I think the challenge is not with the people of Myanmar, and they should not be punished for the military coup, and he's quite right to point out that our own sanctions regime do target the specific individuals or indeed organisations, and that's, I believe, the right approach. He also raises a very key point about the region as itself, and we are working very closely with ASEAN partners on this, and my colleague, Minister Adams, who's responsible for that part of the world, has been speaking directly to counterparts across ASEAN to discuss how we can respond to these events.
Viscount Waverley.
This is an appalling state of affairs. Will government ensure that democracy must prevail with severe consequences for coup leaders not coming immediately to the table? And I trust we'll convene at G7 and underpin and implement a new electoral world order, global standards and processes. And I was pleased to hear the Minister refer to G7. However, given that the probability of the coup was on the cards in the days prior, what representations and actions were taken by diplomats to avert this fiasco, including the assurity of continuous support for those brave and principled people of Myanmar who stood up for their rights as they are, as occurs also elsewhere in the world?
My Lords, I assure you we are working on the ground, as I already alluded to, through our ambassador, and he's also coordinating with other like-minded partners within country, and we are working directly with allies both such as the United States but others as well, including ASEAN partners, to make the points that the Noble Lord has just reflected on.
Baroness Ritchie of Downpatrick.
My Lords, could the Noble Lord the Minister confirm if the government will work with other like-minded allies to impose a global arms embargo on Myanmar, particularly at a time when the UK has presidency of the UN Security Council, in order to underpin human rights?
My Lords, as I've already indicated, the UK is a long-standing supporter of arms embargo, and that is already being applied. Since we left the EU, we've transitioned the arms embargo regime from the EU into UK law, and the UK autonomous Myanmar sanctions regulations prohibit the provision of military-related services, including the provision of technical assistance to or for the benefit of the Myanmar military.
Lord Treesman.
My Lords, my noble friend Lord Collins has already raised the question of the assets of the military leaders and of the companies that they control. And the point that has been made by a number of noble lords about the support of President Biden. I can say from overnight conversations that President Biden's administration is looking very hard to see what steps we propose to take in the same light. The Minister said that we were looking at all the tools, that he feared that he would be a bit frustrating toward us in answering them, but I know he's a man of great integrity. What does the government know about the assets held in London and in the overseas territories? And will the government take steps to sequester those and hold them until they can be provided to the people of Myanmar for their future? And will he make reports to the House on progress in these regards?
My Lord, the noble Lord, who himself has served as a Foreign Office Minister, will know that I can't make those specific commitments from the dispatch box, but I've noted very carefully what he said, as I've already indicated in my earlier answers. We are looking at all options to ensure that those who have committed and are behind the coup are also held fully to account, and that includes all tools. We've noted what the Americans have already acted on in terms of sanctions, and I've said several times before that when we act together on the issue of sanctions, we see a better result.
Baroness Smith of Newnham.
My Lords, the Minister's indication that the government is thinking of formally intervening in the Gambia's genocide case against Myanmar at the ICJ is welcome. Given the government's preference for Parliament to express its views on genocide now rather than taking things to a court, could the Minister tell the House whether parliamentary intervention and calls and suggestions on how to intervene would be welcome?
I always welcome interventions from parliamentary colleagues, and on this specific issue, on the issue of the ICJ intervention, it's been a long-standing position, as I've said before, that we support the action that Gambia has taken. The formal issue of an intervention we regard as something which should be measured and something timely to make sure that an issue can move on. That doesn't mean that we're not supportive, because we haven't formally intervened. And I assure the Noble Lady further that we have been engaging with, for example, the APPG in this respect, who are looking at these particular issues carefully. And recently myself and Minister Adams convened a meeting with, amongst others, my right honourable friend Jeremy Hunt and also Rushnara Ali, to discuss matters on this very issue.
Lord Cormack.
My Lords, I have a very close friend who has a son working in Myanmar, and he's informed me that the British Embassy has ceased to register British residents in the country. Could my noble friend confirm whether this is correct and whether the embassy is indeed fully staffed? And does he also agree with me that our presidency of both the Security Council and the G7 give us a special opportunity to become global Britain? Will we convene a special meeting of the G7, and will we undertake to keep this very, very deplorable situation on the agenda of the Security Council?
The issue of the G7 and the UN Security Council, I believe I've already answered the question my noble friend has raised. On the issue of British nationals, we have advised all British nationals to remain at home where possible. There is a nationwide curfew which makes the issue and the challenge, but if there is any British national who needs to engage, please, if the noble lord could provide me, my noble friend could provide me with the information, I will follow up on that particular issue.
Lord Loomba.
My Lords, Aung San Suu Kyi was hailed by the world leaders as a person who established democracy in Myanmar through her efforts and sacrifices. However, she was accused of failing to protect Myanmar's Rohingya Muslims during the 2016-17 persecution, and there was a worldwide outcry citing her as a complicit in the crimes against Rohingyas. Aung San Suu Kyi is being detained by the army at present. Notwithstanding the Rohingyas issue, the world leaders should support her, same as before, while they are supporting the sanctions. Can the noble lord, the minister, tell us what the chances are of democracy returning to Myanmar again?
I can't state firmly what the chances are, but I can assure you we're doing all we can to ensure the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and the return of the democratically elected government.
Lord Brown of Ladyston.
Lords, it's a credible inference that General Min Aung Hlaing and the military in seizing power partly were motivated by a desire to protect themselves and their families from investigation of their corrupt or lucrative financial deals and economic holdings by a strengthened democratic government. And it is certain that they have managed to squirrel away stolen assets in this country and the British overseas territories and in other democratic countries. So following on my noble friend Lord Treesman's specific question and recognising the limitations that the Minister is under, beyond sanctions, does the government have the power and the intent to trace, seize and freeze these assets so that in due course they can be returned to the rightful owners, the Myanmar people?
My Lord, as the noble lord will be aware, the imposition of sanctions does then mean that any accounts which are being held, or indeed travel which is undertaken, is then limited. So there are specific powers within the sanctions regime.
Lord Bruce O'Benahee.
My Lords, as chair of the International Development Committee in the House of Commons, I heard and saw firsthand the brutal atrocities committed during the last era of military rule. Given the Myanmar economy is largely owned by the army, can we ensure that sanctions are targeted to force the military to recognise that the development of Myanmar and their own interests is incompatible with military dictatorship, and that those sanctions are applied in a way that also helps those protesting against the coup and avoids hitting the poor hardest?
My Lords, that should exactly be the approach of the sanctions regime.
Lord Dubbs.
My Lords, many years ago, when the military were last dictating the country, I visited Myanmar, and I heard directly from victims of torture and the terrible things that had happened. My Lords, we've got the same bunch of people in charge of the country again. Two questions. One is, does the government have any evidence that the military regime is using torture against its political opponents in Myanmar? And secondly, does the minister agree that we have to be very careful before any sort of development aid goes to Myanmar, because it will be used to prop up the infrastructure and help the military, and that we should really oppose any such aid to Myanmar except at a local community level?
My Lords, on the Noble Lord's first question, certainly, we, in all our interactions with the Myanmar authorities, the military, after the military coup, have again stressed upon those that are being held in arbitrary detention are released immediately, and also whilst they are in detention, they will be afforded all their rights. In terms of specific evidence, I'm certainly not aware of any being of the nature he suggests. In terms of the Noble Lord's second point about support for Myanmar, Myanmar is on the crossroads, and that does entail that there is a real challenge that we need to ensure, whether it's through sanctions or any other tools that are available to us, that they target those who are behind this coup and does not lead to the long-term instability of Myanmar and the surrounding regions. But I do accept the point that we need to ensure that support that we give to Myanmar at this crucial junction is very much targeted at the most vulnerable, and our aid and support in this respect is certainly targeted to do just that.